Alireza Firouzja shows us how to play the Italian game. This game is from the 9th round of Norway chess. His opponent is Aryan Tari, who was rated 2642 at the time of the game. Firouzja was rated 2754. This was right before he made that big push and hit 2800. He begins with e4, as you have to if you're going to play the Italian game. His opponent responds with e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. And Alireza Firouzja, with the white pieces, has played the Italian game. His opponent, Aryan Tari, plays knight to f6, inviting the two knights defense, but after d3, bishop c5, it transposes to a mainline Italian. c3, this is a standard idea in the Italian and the Spanish. He might be able to use it to help play the d4, the d3 pawn to d4. It also keeps black's knight out of b4 or d4. d6, castles, and a5. a5 from Aryan Tari is the highest scoring move in this position in my database. In fact, black has a slight plus score in this position. I don't think that it's any better than the other options. It allows the black bishop at c5 to tuck away at a7, but unlike a6, it stops white's move b4, gaining space. At the same time, it weakens black's own b5 square. So it has its pluses and its minuses. It's a decision black can make. It's neither good nor bad. Rook to e1, helping to strengthen that e-pawn, also clearing out the f1 square where the knight can maneuver later. Castles, h3, keeping a knight or bishop out of the g4 square. h6, Tari responds in the same way. Firouzja plays bishop to b5. Bishop tucks back to a7, knight b to d2. And in the Spanish and Italian games, black often struggles to figure out something to do with this knight at c6. It often has trouble finding a comfortable place to land. So Tari plays knight to e7. He wants to maneuver that knight from the not-so-effective square at c6 to the much more effective square at g6. So he plays knight to e7. Firouzja plays d4 to get that nice full pawn center and control a lot of key central squares. Knight goes to g6, and now a4. The reason white plays a4 is that black could otherwise expand on the queen side, play c6, kick that bishop away, then play b5, but play a4 and really expand on the queen side. Firouzja plays the move a4 to keep that expansion from happening. c6 hits the bishop goes to d3, helps defend the e4 pawn. Rook to e8. And in these structures, in the Italian or Spanish game, the primary target for black at first is that e4 pawn. It's a little more vulnerable, and so he's targeting that pawn. White defends it. Firouzja defends it with bishop to d3. The bishop goes back to c2, a flexible square. It can emerge later at b3 if he wants to. Bishop to e6, and then knight to f1. A bishop to e6, by the way, is the novelty of the game, although it seems like a perfectly reasonable, normal move to me. Knight to f1, queen to c7, knight to g3. The knight completes his journey. It could land on f5. It defends the e4 square, which we talked about is very sensitive. Tari plays rook a to d8, and that replaces the rook opposite the queen, which is always a good idea, particularly if the center opens up. It could favor Tari. So Firouzja is going to have to be very careful about that threat against the queen. He plays bishop to e3, continuing to strengthen that center. What white wants to do is make those pawns at e4 and d4 unassailable. They, as strong as they can possibly be. And then when he has that space advantage, then he can begin his attack. So he plays bishop to e3, helping to defend d4. And then d5 is played by Tari. Bishop to b8 is the move preferred by computers, just basically playing some of the same ideas more slowly. But Tari jumps right in with d5. Firouzja takes the pawn with knight takes e5. This would be worse if he went ahead and took on d5, because pawn takes, bishop d4, bishop takes d4, knight d4, bishop d5, and after exchanging off a pair of rooks, black is in good shape here. With well-placed pieces, white would have absolutely nothing. So he decides on knight takes e5 to help preserve that pawn structure as much as possible. And after knight takes e5, here's the trick. Here's the idea that really allows Firouzja to get an edge in the game. He plays bishop f4. He doesn't immediately take the knight at e5. If he did, then after pawn takes, queen e2, bishop e3, queen e5. White would recapture the pawn on e4, and the position would have pretty sterile equality after that. So he plays bishop to f4 first, knight f to d7, e d5, bishop d5, de5, knight e5. So there's a pin on this knight on e5. But at the same time, black still has his rook opposite the queen. Now, when I look at this position, my first instinct for white is to play this move, queen to h5. That way you're sort of taking advantage of the pin on the knight on e5, but you're also not putting your own queen in a precarious position. However, this does not work. This is a really great idea from the computers, although I'm sure they saw it over the board at the time. Bishop takes f2 check. King takes f2, boom, knight to d3 check. Bishop takes d3. Now, black's just given away 2 minor pieces, but he immediately recovers both of them after queen f4 check. The queen cannot interpose because the bishop at d5 controls f3. The king has to move back, and then queen takes g3. And he's already threatening mate on g2. He's up a pawn, better placed pieces, and black would be completely winning in this position. So queen to h5 here doesn't work. Firouzja plays the superior move, queen to e2. This would worry me. I mean, placing the queen opposite that rook, but he's piling up on the knight at e5. Queen to b6. Now, knight to f3 check looks like it would be very dangerous because, again, it's a check, and then the rook attacks the queen. Queen f3, though, white's bishop is still attacking the black queen, so knight to f3 check would not work. So black moves the queen to b6, Aryan Tari, again with the black pieces. He does this so there's no more pin, and now knight to f3 check is threatened. So he plays bishop to e3. If Tari takes on b2 here, then bishop h7 check, and after king h7, queen b2, a discovered check that allows white to win the queen. So Aryan Tari moves the queen back to c7. Firouzja plays to f4, and it looks almost like it's an offer of a draw. After bishop to a7, that probably would be a mistake because of knight to f3 check, gf3, rook e2, rook e2. And here white would have a material advantage, actually. But after a move like b6, the bishop at a7 is trapped. Believe it or not, I think white actually would survive this. After, say, rook a to e1, bishop to e6, bishop to f5, bishop takes, knight f5, queen a7. Firouzja could actually play knight to e7 check, and after king h7, knight to c6, forks the rook and the queen. Queen moves, boom, boom. But this is probably a drawn position because of the weakness of the pawn structure, this queen and 2 rooks and a pawn. So he plays back to bishop to f4. The question is this an offer of a draw? After queen to b6 from Aryan Tari, Firouzja could play the bishop back to e3 and offer the draw, but instead he plays king to h1. He says, I'm going to take a chance here and allow a position where I might even be slightly worse, but it's complicated and I can outplay my opponent. In the game, Tari plays knight to g6, which makes all sorts of sense, but the computer actually says that in this position, bishop c4 is the better option. After, say, queen e3, bishop to d3, queen takes, bishop to b3, knight g6, bishop e3, takes, knight to e5. And even though in this position material is even, the computers like black significantly. Black could play c5, c4, kind of create that hole on d3, really make it strong. There's the isolated pawn at e3, so black would be better. So instead, plays knight to g6, hitting the bishop and the queen. Queen e8, rook e8, rook e8, check. So Firouzja decides to give up the queen for the 2 rooks because he sees what most of us can't yet see, which is that those 2 rooks are going to be able to brilliantly coordinate in the attack on the black king. King goes to h7, rook goes back to e2 to defend the f2 square, which is threatened by the queen and bishop battery. King goes back to g8. If queen to b2, then bishop g6 check, fg6, rook to b2, which we've seen. He'd win the queen that way, so the b2 pawn continues to be poisoned. So Tari plays the king to g8. So now, perhaps that pawn can be taken. The bishop goes to e3, and it turns out that pawn cannot yet be taken, because if he plays queen to b2 here, rook to b1 first, and then after queen c3, bishop takes knight, pawn takes in, bishop takes a7, and white would win a piece. And this is the position the computer's actually like queen to a6, moving the queen away and hitting the rook on e2, although the rook is still defended at the moment. But instead, he plays c5, and he's going to try to create a battery, Tari is, and attack this g2 pawn. What Firouzja understands, though, is that he can let his opponent do what his opponent wants to do, and he'll still be fine. The downside of this move, c6, c5, is that now the bishop on d5 is undefended, and that gives Firouzja the necessary tempo he needs to coordinate his pieces for a really ferocious attack. Rook to d1, queen to c6, rook e to d2, giving away the g2 pawn with check because he's confident in the coordination of his rooks. Bishop g2 check, king to h2, bishop f3, which hits the rook at d1, but rook to d8 check. Now watch this variation. Unbelievable. If Tari were to block this check with the knight, say knight f8, then rook 1 to d6, queen to c7, knight to f5, and white is completely winning. Firouzja would be threatening rook to c8, and that would be curtains. It may not look like it, but it is. Because of bishop to b8, for example, rook to c8. Whoa! The queen is trapped. The queen has nowhere to go. And if the queen takes on c8, boom, knight to e7 check, forks the king and the queen. What a beautiful variation. So instead, Tari plays king to h7. Firouzja plays rook 1 to d6, queen to c7. He's really locking in that queen, taking away the mobility. Then after rook 6 to d7, queen to c6, rook to f7. If instead he had played queen to b6, then rook to f8. And the rook cannot be taken because the knight is pinned. After, say, bishop c6, rook d to d8, and the threat of mate on h8 would only be stopped by giving up the queen for the rook. So instead, Aryan Tari plays queen to c6, Firouzja plays rook to f7, and Tari resigned here, and Firouzja won the game. The reason is, let's say Tari plays bishop to b6, then Firouzja would just double on the 7th rank, and the threats against the g7 pawn, the bishop at f3, the pin along this c2, h7 diagonal, the computer gives Firouzja's position plus 16 here. It's completely winning, and the game would be over, and Tari did resign. Well, that's Firouzja playing the Italian game. Maybe me and you can try to play it as well as he does. Maybe set our sights a little bit lower. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.